From New York to our Bloomberg television and radio audiences worldwide, this is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Westin. We're going to start off today, once again, with the markets, with a lot of equities down, maybe not every single one, but a lot of equities down on those really dismal economic numbers, jobless claims numbers. Abigail Doolittle is here with a report.
Yeah, we do certainly have a bit of a risk-off tone today, David, and much of it does seem to have to do with the economic data, the jobless claims, along with the personal spending. Some of it could also be a spillover from yesterday, because, of course, we had a big rally yesterday, the S&P 500 up more than 2.5%. Much of that having to do with Gilead's virus drug. I heard a great conversation that you had with Bloomberg Opinions, Mac Neeson, who was saying it's really not a game changer. It's not a cure. It's not a vaccine. So maybe the markets yesterday got ahead of themselves a little bit, and then today we have another brutal week, staggering numbers of jobless claims. It's clear that this recessionary behavior, the worst since the Great Depression, could go on longer than was perhaps initially anticipated, a really long slog. So you do see stocks down about 1.3%. The small caps, which have been doing so well into today, up 6 days in a row, now down 3.2%. Crude oil, go figure, is actually higher, so a little bit of a relief rally there from the brutal selling that we had in oil for about 2 weeks. But confirming the risk-off tone, David, a rally for bonds. So investors taking some chips off the table and really moving to the sidelines, at least today.
So, Abigail, as you say, a mildly risk-off tone today. At the same time, if you look at the S&P overall over time, despite the really abysmal economic numbers, we're down to something like 9%. What do the technicals indicate? Are we still maybe a little higher than we have a right to be?
So there's actually, technically speaking, there's reason to think that the markets may actually go just a little bit higher. If you take a look at the RSI on the S&P 500, it's nowhere near to overbought. But what you would want to see from a bear standpoint are a set of lower highs. So we'll certainly be watching for that. But you were just talking about S&P 500 numbers, and it's stunning what we have seen in this month of April, David, because we may be down 9% from the all-time high. But in the month of April, the S&P 500 right now on pace for its best month since 1987. Much of this has to do with the big mega cap momentum strength, because about 20% of the index is made up from some of the top 5 tech stocks. So take a look at that FANG index on the month, up 19%. Apple and Amazon, my gosh, David, Amazon up 24% in the month of April. Both Apple and Amazon report after the bell. It'll be interesting to see whether or not they deliver results that match that sort of performance for the month of April.
Okay, Abigail, thank you so very much. We're going to go right now to some playback for what President Trump said at the White House just a few minutes ago.
I think next year is going to be a spectacular year in terms of growth, in terms of bringing our country back. I think we're going to have a really good year. We want to be where we were, and I think we can actually surpass where we were. And we were the strongest anywhere in the world. We were the best that we ever were, but we were the strongest anywhere in the world. But I view what we have now as obviously a period of, here we are. It is what it is. We just got hit by a vicious virus that should have never been allowed to escape China. They should have stopped it at the source. They didn't do that. 184 countries have been devastated by it, including China, by the way, because I looked at their numbers, and their numbers are terrible. And it's just a very tough situation for the people of our country. All the loss, the death, it's a terrible thing. But I think we're going to make a very strong comeback. It'll start with the third quarter. I think you're going to see some pretty good numbers. I think you're going to see really good transition numbers. But the fourth quarter is going to be, I really believe it's going to be terrific, and I think that next year is going to be a great year.
And is it fair for the voters to take into consideration your handling of the pandemic when they assess whether to re-elect you in the fall?
Sure, I think they do. I think they have to do a number of things. They do have to do that, and maybe Phil could speak to that, because I think I've handled it, and not me. I think our whole group has been spectacular. We had ventilators. We didn't have any. We built them. We have thousands, tens of thousands are right now under construction. And we've given, as Phil said, you got, I think, more ventilators than anybody in the United States. New Jersey needed them very badly.
Yep.
And there was never a person that needed a ventilator that didn't get one in any state. Not one person that needed a ventilator. So we didn't say he didn't get a ventilator and somebody passed away, somebody didn't make it. Now we had a mask problem. Now we have so many masks, we don't know what to do with them. We had a big problem. And you have to understand, we took over, the cupboards were bare. And the thing that frankly, it's not as tough as the ventilator situation. We're the king of ventilators, but what we have done is on testing, we're doing numbers the likes of which nobody's ever seen before. And I told you, the president of South Korea, President Moon, called me to congratulate me on testing. And we did more tests than any other country anywhere in the world. And I think they told me yesterday a number, if you add up the rest of the world, we've done more testing. And it's a higher quality test. So I think we've done I think the whole team, federal government, we built hospitals for you and others.
You bet.
We built medical centers, and I'm talking about thousands and thousands of beds, many, many medical centers. We had, as you know, we had the governor of Florida and the governor of Louisiana over the last 2 days. They could not have been, and one was a Democrat, and this gentleman happens to be a proud Democrat. They could not have been more supportive of the effort of the federal government. And I'll tell you, Jim, let me just tell you, we started off with empty cupboards. The last administration left us nothing. We started off with bad, broken tests and obsolete tests. What we've come up with, between the Abbott laboratories, we have the 5-minute, did they test you today?
They did test me.
Good. Now I feel better.
Yeah. I'm negative.
You did the 5-minute,
I
Abbott
did
test.
the quick turnaround.
It's so great.
I feel like a new man.
That's a brand, you know what, that's a brand new test. That didn't exist 8 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And now it's like the rage. Everybody wants that test. No, I think we've done a really great job.
But the Obama administration, people from the Obama administration would disagree on your assessment that the cupboards were bare. They said that there was equipment.
I know, Jim. Let me just tell you.
That's fine. You say broken tests. It's a new virus, so how could the test be broken?
We had a
new
broken
test.
Jim. We had broken tests. We had tests that were obsolete. We had tests that didn't take care of people. But here's what's very important: if you take a look at the swine flu, H1N1, or as Joe Biden would say, N1H1, but it's actually wrong. He didn't even know the name. Okay, H1N1, the swine flu. The Obama administration was a disaster, and they did polling on how did they do. And their polls were so negative, so bad. They did a very poor job. And they did a poor job on a lot of things. They did a poor job on our military. They did a poor job on our ammunition. When I got here, we had no ammunition. Just like we had no ammunition, we had very little medical, too. So I think when you ask, how did we do? And I have to say it because the news is so fake and so corrupt. I think we did a spectacular job. I'm not even referring to me. I'm referring to all of these people, including your people who have been working with my people so closely.
You bet.
But the federal government has done a spectacular job to a point where we're building now. We're going to have thousands and thousands of ventilators, and we're helping other countries because Phil doesn't need ventilators. You needed them very badly at the beginning.
We did.
And maybe you could say something to Jim's question.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a view on the history, but I will say this: in our hour of need, whether it was ventilators, the Army Corps building out capacity, FEMA with our testing sites, and a big part of our ability to reopen as fast as we all want to is to rapidly expand testing.
Right.
And you all literally in the here and now this week are helping us in a big way to at least, I would expect by the end of May, thanks to you and your team's help, we'll be able to at least double, and I hope more than double, our testing capabilities. And because of that, that will allow us to much more aggressively and responsibly do the reopening that we all need to do.
And Phil, how do we do on ventilators as an example, where you were really in, you needed them badly?
Yeah, we got them. I mean, there's just no other way to put it. And I'm told that we were the #1 state recipient of ventilators. And this was, we were at the edge, and this is life or death stuff, and we got them, and we're forever thankful for that.
Thank you, Phil.
Mr. President, on this vaccine operation, Warp Speed, who's in charge of that? And are you overpromising when you say you're going to have 300 million doses of vaccine?
No, I'm not overpromising. I don't know who said it, but whatever the maximum is, whatever you can humanly do, we're going to have. And we hope we're going to come up with a good vaccine. Johnson & Johnson and Oxford and lots of different great companies, representatives of our country in some ways. NIH is working very hard and doing a terrific job. No, I hope we're going to have a vaccine, and we're going to fast track it like you've never seen before. If we come up with a vaccine, I think they probably will.
And who's in charge of that Operation Warp Speed?
We have, you know who's in charge of it, honestly? I am. I'll tell you, I'm really in charge of it. I could say somebody else. I will say we're dealing with, as you know, the general and the admiral. They're very much in charge. But I think probably more than anything, I'm in charge. And I'm the one that gets blamed, and I get blamed anyway. Don't forget, if we come up with a vaccine in record time, they'll say I should have done it faster. But we have a lot of good possibilities. Like the Gilead yesterday, that was a big thing. That was a big thing. And as explained, and I think very importantly, that was a step. You know, that was a big step, 31% step. But the step means, I guess, Deborah, what Tony yesterday was explaining, the step means you now take another step, all of a sudden you're up to 50, 60, 70. But that was a very positive, that was a big step as I understand it. Okay? Thank you.
Mr. President.
Yeah, go ahead, please. Go ahead, please. Yeah, Jeff, go.
Thank you, sir. The intelligence agencies today said that they agree with the scientific community that the virus did originate in China but was not man-made and was not genetically modified. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I haven't seen the report yet, but I will tell you, if you speak to the head of intelligence right now, you speak to the head, they did say that I was given a briefing when I said I was given it, not before, and they also said that it wasn't specific and it was not a panic briefing. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to be invaded. It was in January, later January.
You were given
And I think what you'll do is you'll speak to them. In fact, I'll ask Mark to make a report to you because the news was totally, you know, as usual, fake and corrupt. So intelligence is doing a report, and the report turned out to be exactly as I said. Okay?
So, Mr. President, so you're saying that you got a briefing in January about
No, I'm not saying
about
it.
the
No,
coronavirus?
I'm not. You didn't hear me. I said intelligence is saying it, and
So
they're going to give a report, and it will make you very unhappy because it makes you so wrong.
Well-
You in particular. All right, go ahead. Behind you, please. Please.
Governor, states received $150 billion in the first CARES Act. What are you going to need now to get back on your feet? What have you told the president on that front? And how do you address Republican complaints that the federal government should not be bailing out states who were badly managed prior to the pandemic?
Yeah, so I've been in office going on 2.5 years, and I got elected to sort of fix the economy, and we made a lot of progress on what I would call the legacy issues. Record pension payments, stabilizing indebtedness, record surpluses, and as Mike Tyson says, everyone's got a plan until you get punched in the face.
And we did.
And we did. So we've got a plan, and we're comfortable with the progress. It's going to take a while on the legacy stuff. The financial assistance we need, and we need a significant amount. This is a big hit, and this is somewhere in New Jersey alone could be $20 to $30 billion. But this is to allow us to keep firefighters, teachers, police, EMS on the payroll, serving the communities in their hour of need. And that's something that we feel strongly about. We don't see it as a bailout. We see this as a partnership, doing the right thing in what is the worst healthcare crisis in the history of our nation. And I want to again thank the President for an extraordinary spirit of partnership across the whole spectrum of our needs. And I want to reiterate that. Thank you.
I will say that's a tough question because you're talking about the states and whether you call it a bailout or a lot of money, and a lot of it's for years long before you were there. You can't have a better representative than this man, that I can tell you. Plus, he's an old Goldman Sachs guy. And what they don't know about him, he's done a great job, but he went through a big operation just before this happened. And that's a hell of a thing.
Thank you, Mr. President.
That was a
Mr.
big deal.
President,
Thank you, sir.
Mr. President, are you worried about the food supply chain?
No,
breakdown?
not at all. No, we solved that
Especially
problem.
the meat market.
We solved that problem yesterday. I expect to see the supply chain as strong as ever, maybe stronger for certain reasons. We did something. We had a roadblock. It was a legal roadblock more than anything else. It was a foolish thing that nobody ever took care of for a long time, and we took care of it. No, I expect things to go very smoothly.
So the American people shouldn't worry about any shortage?
Not even a
in the
little
market
bit.
at all?
There's a lot of supply too, but now they're going to get it, and that was solved yesterday, very late in the evening. Okay?
And Mr.
Mr.
President,
President,
At what point do people
people need another check if unemployment's at 20%?
Well, we're talking about that. I know a lot of people are talking about it, but we've given a lot of stimulus. And again, we think now it's so great. I'm so happy that you're opening up parks and things, because that's a big step for New Jersey, because they were hit very hard. I think you're going to see something that's going to surprise maybe the world. And you know, we're the leader of the world. We're really the leader, in this case, the leader of the world. And we've done better. If you look at our deaths, if you look at mortality rates, if you look at the things in fact, I'm going to get a chart, because it's maybe the most impressive thing, right? How we've done. And that's a tribute to the governors, and it's a tribute to the federal government and all of us working together. But I would love you to get that if you could, because we're right at the top, meaning top in a positive way of those charts. I think you're going to see economic numbers that are going to be fantastic. I believe it very strongly. And you're going to start to see it with the transition period, which is number 3. And quarter 4, you're going to have tremendous numbers. You're going to have tremendous numbers. And I think next year you're going to really have tremendous numbers.
Mr. President, can we ask you about General Flynn?
Yeah.
Are you going to pardon him? This is what you tweeted back in December 2017. I had to fire General Flynn because he lied to the Vice President and the FBI.
Yeah.
Do you still believe that he lied to the Vice President and the FBI?
Yeah, well, I'll
Should
tell
he be
you,
punished for that?
sure. When I looked at what they did to him, they tormented him. Dirty cops tormented General Flynn. General Flynn is a fine man, 35 years or so in the military. You don't get to be where he is by being bad, that I can tell you. And then right at the beginning of the administration, the dirty cops came in. And you see the notes, Jim. I mean, whether you're on our side, that side, whatever. I mean, I assume, let's all talk about fairness. What they did to General Flynn, and by the way, to Roger Stone and to others, was a disaster and a disgrace. And it should never be allowed to happen in this country again. And what I really hoped, because CNN tormented him, in all fairness, I really hope to see, because they haven't been doing it, and I appreciate your question, I hope to see that CNN will not even apologize, which they should, but just cover it fairly, because he's in the process of being exonerated. If you look at those notes from yesterday, that was total exoneration. These were dirty, filthy cops at the top of the FBI, and you know the names better than I do, and they were dishonest people. Now we have to see what's going to happen. But General Flynn was treated like nobody should, and I'm not talking about generals, I'm saying like nobody in this country should be treated.
So
and they did it right at the
Why did you
beginning.
fire him at the time?
They did it right, Jim, they did it right. Well, look at what they did to the guy. I mean, he couldn't have known too much what was happening. They came at him with 15 buses, and he's standing in the middle of a highway. What they did to this man, they tormented him. They destroyed him. But he's going to come back, like I say, he's going to come back bigger and better. But what they did to him, and I hear there's a lot of other stuff coming out if I believe everything I'm reading, because I like to stay out of it. I don't have to stay out of it at all, but I like to stay out of it. And Jim, what they did to him is terrible, and I hope that CNN's going to give him a fair shake and cover it, because I think it's very important. Yeah,
Sir,
please.
just to follow up on, was it a mistake to fire him? Would you bring him back on to the administration?
Well, what I wish I had was all the information where they were out to get him. They wanted him, they were trying to force him to lie. You see the written statements where they were trying to force him into a position where we can get him on a lie, or can we get him this way or that way? This is terrible. This is like what happened in, and I'm not going to name the countries because we deal with these countries, okay? But what would happen in other countries, not the USA. What they did to General Flynn and others is a disgrace. And I hope, really, I hope your networks are going to cover it. Because, you know, I've seen where it's the biggest story in the world a year ago and a year and a half, Flynn, and then he's essentially exonerated. Now, that's not official yet.
We have been listening to President Donald Trump. He's been meeting in the White House with the New Jersey Governor, Phil Murphy. There at the very end, what we heard was a defense of General Flynn, his former national security advisor. But for most of the remarks, he said that there's going to be a very strong recovery in the United States. He said actually the numbers, the economic numbers for the fourth quarter would be tremendous, in his word, and going into next year as well. He also touted the testing system they have in place and also said that they're on track for maybe setting some records in developing a vaccine. At the same time, he was asked about the food supply chain, and he said that that has been fixed now, that has been taken care of with his order that the meatpacking plants remain open. So that's President Donald Trump at the White House with New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy. Now let's go from the United States over to Europe, because we've got European economic numbers today, and those numbers were worse than we expected. The overall GDP shrank 3.8%, and Christine Lagarde, the president of the ECB, said in her news conference later in the day that it could get as bad as 12% down over the overall year, depending on how long this coronavirus remains. We welcome now Stephanie Flanders. She's our senior executive editor for economics at Bloomberg and also a regular contributor to Wall Street Week. So Stephanie, let's start with the numbers in Europe. As I say, they were worse than I believe were expected, with more bad to come. How bad is it going to get?
Yeah, and I guess it's important to remember that those figures are not annualized, right? So you have a 3.8% fall in the first quarter, but that's like a 17 or 18% annualized fall if you were reporting it in the U.S., and it's, of course, that's a big number. I have to say, I'm a little bit reassured in a funny kind of way by these numbers, which obviously relate to the first quarter, so not before we had some of the biggest lockdown measures in some of the economies, because it suggests that we have a handle on how this is affecting the economy. It's not much of a silver lining, but actually our economists at Bloomberg Economics, we had been looking at more high-frequency data and looking at some data that the French had pulled together on the impact of lockdowns. And our numbers were a bit bigger than the consensus, and they've been kind of borne out by this. So not to gloat, but at least it suggests that we have a handle on what the second quarter is going to look like, what the impact of these broader lockdowns is going to be. And we might also start to take some heart from the high-frequency numbers we're looking, for example, at Germany, where electricity usage is starting to pick back up. You know, we are starting to see some benefits from that slow move away from total lockdown. But of course, the big picture is still a historic decline.
Stephanie, you have a handle perhaps on the numbers and how bad they're likely to get. Do we have a handle on what needs to be done about it? We had the ECB come out and make some changes today to try to help things. At the same time, Madame Lagarde said we really need a coordinated fiscal stimulus. I think it's fair to say that both in the United States and over in Europe, the first response is we have to really protect the supply side. But how do we get the demand going again with all the consumers having sat home for so long and, frankly, being concerned about their health?
Yeah, and we've seen that, as you know, in Wuhan, some of the places that have had, a removal of the supply side shock, if you like. People are going to work, they're in the factories, but the demand's not coming back. People are not going back to restaurants, they're not going out to spend. So, of course, that is a worry. I think the fiscal programs so far, the national policies, have been all about keeping the economy in suspended animation, keeping jobs in place. And they've been quite successful at that, I think probably more successful than the states. But where they may be missing and where certainly Lagarde, the European Central Bank, will be looking for more from governments and from the European Commission is that piece you're talking about, the stimulus. Once we start to see economies slowly moving out of lockdown, as we now are, what's going to be there to actually stimulate economies as opposed to just keeping them on hold, which is effectively what they've been doing for this period of lockdown. But so much uncertainty about the path of that lockdown from here, because we know Germany, for example, is starting to see a push back up in infections. So other countries are looking and saying, maybe we can't follow in Germany's footsteps.
So, Stephanie, to bring it back to the United States for a moment and to compare and contrast, we heard from the Fed and the Fed chair, Jay Powell, yesterday. And one of the things he said was over the medium term, not just the short term, the medium term, we really have challenges. And he suggested even there might be longer term damage. We have had the fiscal stimulus, at least a lot of it here in the United States. How can we learn from the U.S. experience as it applies to Europe?
I think it's tricky. I think we have seen a willingness, if you like, to have more people join the unemployment rolls and then increase that support for people who are unemployed. So we had more jobless claim numbers today from the U.S. That's been, if you like, the U.S. way, that they've been less protective of employment, but pushing a lot more money into the economy and perhaps getting it to businesses as well, though we know not some states more than others. So I guess there is a lesson there, but the worry the Fed is stating is pushing all these people out of work. It would be nice to think that a lot of this work will immediately spring back, gig workers, younger workers may be able to be flexible, But we know historically, once you lose your job, especially if you're at the beginning of your career, you can have a permanent hit in terms of wages and you can find it permanently harder to get jobs. So that's the kind of longer-term hit that the Fed is talking about, and frankly why they're seeing maybe unemployment not getting back in the 4 or 5% range for several years.
And it's a hit that is not necessarily evenly distributed. We're seeing dispersion. I mean, for example, let's just take big tech in the United States. It's doing really, really well. We've had earnings out this week that are very, very good. Are you seeing that in Europe as well as the United States? And in fact, you're seeing some parts of the economy that are likely to come back faster and better. Others are really much more challenged.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, and of course we've also had that of the story of the sort of market performance of the last few years, right? One of the reasons why Europe has consistently lagged is because it was the tech sector that was doing so well, and Europe just had a smaller tech sector. So that's definitely a concern if you think that sector is the one that's also coming out of this strongest. I think in Europe's favor was the point I made earlier that they have perhaps done a better job of preserving work in places like Germany and France. So if you can get the demand back, you possibly don't have quite such a hill to climb in terms of getting people back into work. But I think that sectoral breakdown is going to be a concern in the U.S. as well, because we know that, for example, women and lower paid workers who had actually been doing a bit better the last 4 or 5 years in the U.S. after a long time of problems, certainly for the low-wage sector, it's that bit of the labor market that has now been really hit. And, of course, you have to worry about that on both sides of the Atlantic.
Absolutely. Stephanie Flanders, thank you so very much. She's Bloomberg's Senior Executive Editor for Economics. Coming up on Balance of Power, we're going to talk to Sam Palmisano about big tech. He's the former head of IBM. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We're going to go now to Mark Crumpton because he has Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. Dr. Anthony Fauci says he expects a quick decision from the Food and Drug Administration. America's top infectious disease expert is hoping the agency approves an emergency authorization of remdesivir. Gilead says more than 50,000 courses of its experimental coronavirus treatment drug are packed and ready to ship. Dr. Fauci says a trial of the drug helped patients recover faster. The FDA says the agency is moving at lightning speed on the treatment. U.S. spy agencies have come out with a statement on the origins of the coronavirus. They're agreeing with the widespread scientific consensus that it was not man-made or genetically modified. The next step for the intelligence community is determining whether the outbreak began through contact with animals or from a mistake in a laboratory in Wuhan. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the worst of the pandemic is over for the UK. Speaking from his number 10 Downing Street office today, Prime Minister Johnson said, quote, "We are past the peak and we are on the downward slope," end quote. The Prime Minister returned to work this week after recovering from the virus. The UK likely won't meet its key target of testing 100,000 people a day for the coronavirus. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Well, the pandemic has drawn us even closer to tech, whether it's our working from home or our keeping in touch with loved ones. What are the long-term potential effects, though, of the pandemic on the tech industry? For some answers, we turn now to Sam Palmisano, the former head of IBM, and I'm proud to say a contributor to Wall Street Week. So welcome, Sam. Great to have you here. So what do you think are the longer-term ramifications for the tech industry? We've seen some very strong numbers out of the big tech companies this week.
Yes. Well, I think actually it's interesting, Dave, if you watch what's going on. I mean, the guys that are well positioned into the pandemic are continuing to do well, especially those that are providing services like you were mentioning, connectivity in business as well as to the individual. And we all connect with our families that way in this environment. issues associated with the entertainment in the home and those kinds of things, facilitating that. And you see that also in the large tech companies, especially those that have other business models, but also like YouTube with part of Google, et cetera, or Alphabet now. So fundamentally, you see a lot of that going on. I think that the broader trend long term for tech is how behavior is changing and how tech is facilitating that change. There's some classic examples. One, I think that leaps off the charts is telemedicine. I mean, telemedicine obviously uses the connectivity technology, whether that be WebEx or Zoom or whatever it happens to be. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, it's a whole different way of practicing medicine. Now, this has been around for a while. There are companies like Heal that I know quite well have been around. But as soon as it was approved from a payment perspective, the insurance companies and Medicare, et cetera, these now approaches have lit up. Now, the point of that is that people will get used to that. And if you have the option of not going to the doctor's office and waiting in the reception area for, as you know, a very long time sometimes because things happen, that could be attractive to you. It doesn't mean you'll never go see a doctor again, but it could be an attractive alternative. You look at things that are going on in commerce. Of course, everybody talks about the big commerce player being Amazon and what they've been able to do in non-prescription drugs. It's like a 9-fold growth, if I'm not mistaken. But even small groceries, small retailers and the stuff, at least in our environment, are using things like Instacart. You can order and deliver everything to the home. So all those patterns are going to continue to expand. Telemedicine, touchless payments, e-commerce, those sorts of, down to the small retailers, small grocers, those kinds of things. I believe that the consumer will change. And as a result of the consumer changing their consumption patterns, it creates opportunities for big tech.
Sam, talk to us as the former head of a big public company as well about the role of a public company in this world. We now have the government handing out a lot of money, sometimes in exchange for equity. At the same time, some companies are becoming criticized if they're not socially responsible. Is ESG more important than ever?
I think, first of all, I'll start with ESG, or social responsibility, connecting to your society, was always fundamentally important. We can argue about the extent that people did that or not did that. We can talk about the pressure of short-term, investment, et cetera, but fundamentally, it was strategically important to your brand, because if you do things that are valuable to your individual customers or to society, your brand will be enhanced, your value will be created, and that will show up in your shareholder price as well. So I think it's always been important. I believe, quite honestly, large companies today have been extremely responsible. I mean, if you look at what people are doing, whether it's 3M or whether it's going on in biotech, you just talked about Gilead, what they've been able to do in a very short period of time as well. You talk about what other guys are doing to help in the pandemic. Even the energy companies that are constantly maligned, from sustainability activists and those sorts of things, turned over their chemical facilities to produce the chemicals that go into the products such as PPE and those kinds of things. So, and automotive with Ford, GM, and ventilators, all those things. I mean, those guys have been phenomenally responsible. So I believe that, that kind of behavior, when you get into a crisis, big companies are stepping up. There's no business case to justify some of these things in this environment, which we all do understand. But fundamentally, they're doing the responsible thing. You even see some creative things in small companies. There's a small little company in Connecticut, New York. It's actually created the platform and technology that allows people to get back to work faster. I mean, I won't go take you through all the details, but basically it certifies your test results in your health. And whether you're working into work or you're going into a restaurant for that matter, or you and I in the studio again, it'll say, hey, Sam's technically healthy. He's passed all these tests, and it's on his phone, and you let him in, and he goes on. And we can do this again like we used to do it live in your studio.
Sam, you've had a lot of experience with supply chains and a lot of experience with China. Do you anticipate that one of the consequences of this pandemic, when we come out of it, which we will at some point, will be some permanent changes in our relations, our business relations with China, and for that matter, in extended supply chains around the world?
Well, I'll start with what should have happened in the supply chain, then where it goes, because I think it's important to understand. Supply chains should have been designed for resiliency. By that I mean you have multiple alternatives. So you didn't have a major component in one geography, wherever it happened to be, so you could rebalance if a crisis occurred. That could have been a tsunami. It could be weather. It could be lots of things. It could have been a military action. I mean, we all designed our supply chains, so if those events occurred on a global basis, you could readjust. If you look at the companies that have not been as impacted as dramatically by this, they're the ones that had I'll call it a resilient, balanced supply chain. What's driving the changes to the supply chain, quite honestly, David, is the fact that technology, more so than low cost. So therefore, which drove it up until I'd say maybe 10 years ago was cost. Where do you locate for cost? And you see that all over the world. Yes, a lot went to China. China became the manufacturing hub of the world. There's no doubt about it. However, that was more of a cost-driven scenario. It started with the trade negotiations, but fundamentally people were looking at this thing and saying, look, I need to have flexibility in my supply chain. I also want to be close to the market so I can respond quickly. So if for whatever set examples I might use, if you have a market that's really strong in some area of apparel, you want to have some capability there. Now that's enabled through things like 3D printing and all these other technologies that are now available to you. But fundamentally, it's going to be a balancing act of resiliency and responsiveness to your customers over time. That is what's going to drive the supply chain. We've done a lot of work in supply chains and why it's so important to stimulate them to get people back to work. But fundamentally, long-term strategically, everybody's going to rebalance their supply chains to make sure they're more resilient going into the future.
Sounds good to me. Thank you so much to Sam Palmisano. He is, of course, the former CEO of IBM, also a contributor to Wall Street Week. Speaking of which, we premiere the next episode of Wall Street Week tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television, and then we'll run it through the weekend. Please join us for Wall Street Week tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Coming up here on Balance of Power, well, the restaurants have been hit particularly hard by this pandemic. We're going to talk with the pioneer, really, the leader in fast casual dining, the CEO of Panera Bread. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Well, for just about all of us these days, it's just not an option to go to a restaurant and eat there, which really puts a lot of pressure on the restaurant business. We welcome now Neeraj Chaudhary. He is CEO of Panera Bread, which, as we all know, was really the pioneer, the leader in fast casual dining. So, Neeraj, thank you so much for joining us. But before we get to your business, Panera Bread, give us a sense of Feeding America. I know that's a partnership that's very important to you.
That's right. I think, at these unprecedented times, what's happening is the health crisis is fast moving into becoming a financial and a humanitarian crisis. I think there are 55 million Americans who are going to suffer from hunger, and 20% of the food banks may run out of food in the next 4 to 5 weeks. And, that just can't be right. And brands like ours must step up and do the right thing. So we just launched this movement called with Feeding America, who's our partner, called Together Without Hunger. And the part of this movement, our commitment at Panera, is to serve up to 500,000 freshly prepared meals to children and families who are most impacted by the pandemic. And for this to be a movement, we have a program called #See a Plate, Fill a Plate, so that we're hoping that many Americans around the country will participate and help us in this effort by serving meals to those who are impacted the most at this time.
It's a great venture, really a great venture, and I wish you well with it. Let's talk about Panera Bread and where you are right now. How many of your stores are open? How much business are you doing right now?
So we've actually kept almost 85 to 90% of the stores open through the crisis, with the intent of keeping as many associates as we could employed and offering our services to our customers. So I think that has been our intent. We saw a major disruption when the crisis had just started in the beginning of March, and slowly we are seeing a bit of a pickup in the business over the last few months. But still, it is nowhere near the levels at which it needs to be, and we have been, massively impacted.
Now, is this takeout, essentially entirely takeout? How much of your business was takeout before the pandemic crisis?
Fortunately at Panera, we have very strong off-premise channels like drive-thrus and delivery and rapid pickup. We also launched curbside order and pickup across 1,000 of our cafes very quickly in a week's time to provide that convenient access to our customers. So because of a lot of our off-premise infrastructure, but also e-commerce, almost 50% of our business currently is coming from e-commerce, and we have a very strong e-commerce infrastructure as well. So because of those two aspects, our business is slowly coming back, but still has a long way to go.
As I understand it, Panera is a mixed distribution. Some are franchises and some are own stores. With respect to the franchises, what sort of assistance are you being asked for from your franchises? What are you doing for them? Are you giving some forgiveness or some delays on some of the payments that are due? Are you helping them with some of the costs for their protective equipment? What are you doing for the franchisees?
Yeah, I think we have this mindset of one Panera and, working together as a family. We have a very trusting relationship with our franchise partners. And right at the start of the crisis, we offered deferment for some of the royalties and fees so that they had enough time to get their businesses back into shape. And we continue to offer that assistance and also working very closely with them through the whole process of what's the best way to respond to the crisis, and also now are engaged in plans to reopen the business with our partners.
What are your plans to reopen the business? If you can summarize them, I assume it varies state to state.
Yeah, we are following federal guidelines and state guidelines, but we also have our own guidelines in terms of what do we need to do to ensure the full safety of our associates and customers at all times. So we have a big checklist that we're developing, for example, a wellness station where we want to check the temperatures of our associates when they come into work, plexi shield barriers for our associates when they're interacting with customers, social distancing in the dining areas, and so on. So we have a whole sort of set of measures we want to put in place to ensure the full safety of our customers and employees. And we plan to open in a very phased manner to ensure that we're keeping safety paramount.
Niren, what about the supply chain of food for you and your stores? There's a lot of concern about that. The President of the United States has said he thinks it's fixed now by ordering the meat packing plants to remain open. Are you having difficulties in your supply chain?
I think our supply chain, fortunately, right now is fairly secure. I think, as you know, we have our unique requirements of ingredients that are always free of any. We don't, offer artificial ingredients, and we offer proteins that are raised responsibly. So our supply chain is fairly secure. In fact, we've made a very interesting pivot at these times, recognizing that there is a huge amount of friction for high-demand grocery items. We have very rapidly opened a new line of business called Panera Grocery. So customers now can order bakery products, dairy products, fresh produce from your nearest Panera, and that will be delivered to your home in less than 1 hour the same day. So we are actually, we feel confident about our supply chain and indeed are offering to solve this friction point for customers during this time.
Can you give us any sense of the volume that you're doing in groceries, these home-delivered groceries? It certainly is something a lot of us need right now.
That's right, yeah. We are actually quite encouraged by the initial response. Almost 80% of the customers are tending to buy, a loaf of bread or some yogurt or dairy products or fresh produce along with the meals that they're ordering at Panera Bread. And we are tracking between 1% to 2% of our sales on a weekly basis is coming from grocery, and our margins are also fairly decent. So we are hoping that this will turn out to be an incremental revenue opportunity for us. And it ends up, it's a win for the customer. We're solving a problem. It's a win for our associates because we can keep them employed. And indeed, it's a win for Panera as a business.
Okay, really appreciate you being with us today. This is Niren Chethauri. He is the CEO of Panera Bread. And this is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, we just talked to the head of Panera Bread. We also talked to the head of another major food chain earlier in the day, Yum Brands. My colleague Alex Steele talked to David Gibbs, who's CEO of Yum Brands.
We have the benefit at Yum with our brands, KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut being in over 140 countries, of seeing some of the learnings that are coming out of markets that have experienced this a little bit longer than others. For example, many of the markets in Asia. So I think the recovery curve will vary by markets, and it will vary depending on the kinds of stores you have in each market. If you have a heavy preponderance of dine-in business, that takes a little bit longer to come back. The off-premise business actually is pretty well designed for this environment and come back a lot quicker.
One analyst was talking about sort of trying to glean what that meant, and it said 20% of global units are still closed, so you could be looking at, double-digit 30% sales decline. When do you expect to have that kind of visibility?
Well, what we've seen is we're off the lows when it comes to unit closures. At one point, we had 11,000 of our over 50,000 units closed. Now we're below 10,000, and we're reopening units every day. In fact, we just announced that we'll be reopening about 100 KFC units in the UK by next week. So we're on the other side, we believe, of the closures, and as you know, in a lot of markets right now, people are reopening dining rooms. So we're on the upswing, but we can't predict, and like anybody else, we can't predict exactly the timing of all the reopenings. That's why a lot of companies you're seeing are withdrawing guidance, and until we get a better sense for what these curves look like. But you also see, Yum China, one of our, the largest licensed business that we have, report the other day and talk about the fact that they're on the other side of this and that they're seeing almost all of their stores reopened. I think they're at 99% of the stores reopened now. So that's all very encouraging for us. And again, we love the fact that we have this off-premise business that is really designed to succeed in these times.
As you reopen, what have you noticed are your bigger issues as you reopen, regardless of the demand on the customer side, in terms of just your operations?
Well, the reopening challenge is really, it's two different stories. In the United States, the vast majority of our stores are open because our business is very heavily skewed to off-premise. 95% of our KFCs and Taco Bells in the U.S. have drive-thrus on them, and obviously our pizza business in the U.S. is designed for off-premise consumption with delivery and carry-out. And one of the challenges we faced very early on, all around the world, was this idea that customers wanted contactless or contact-free access to our brands, which is why we rolled out contactless delivery and contactless carry-out. And that's working quite well in the U.S. So the challenge of reopening dining rooms in the U.S. is now a new challenge, and we're going to take our time on that and better understand what the landscape is, what the challenges are going to be, learn from others that go early on that, and we'll make sure that whatever we do, we never put our customers or our employees in danger. Internationally, again, varying by market, the challenge of reopening can vary. What we're seeing in a lot of markets is the best way to reopen a store is to start by reopening the off-premise business and then shift to opening the dine-in over time as we learn more.
Are you having any issues with food supply chains?
I think you're seeing a lot of headlines about the supply chain and the impact on it. And certainly when you have such a massive shift with restaurants closing and people going to grocery, the supply chain was not designed, for the mix that we're seeing now between grocery and restaurant. So that's pressuring it, and coupled with, plant closures is creating this pressure on the supply chain. For us, we have good visibility to our near-term supply chain and feel good about that. We're obviously working with suppliers to create contingency plans for the longer term. But I think we'll work through it in partnership with our suppliers. We're also fortunate, our biggest market, the United States, we have a purchasing co-op with real fantastic expertise that does a great job of buying on behalf of all of our brands in the U.S. So that scale gives us some advantages in working with suppliers to make sure that we get the supply we need.
That was David Gibbs. He is the CEO of Yum Brands, talking earlier today to my colleague Alex Steele. So we brought you up to speed now on the situation with the various restaurants around the country. They also are going to have a special Wall Street Week tomorrow, debuting at 6 p.m. Eastern Time and then running through the weekend. Join us for Wall Street Week. In the meantime, in the second hour of Balance of Power over on Bloomberg Radio, we're going to talk with the former head of FEMA. He is Craig Fugate. He has a new plan for what he calls a National Resilience Corps that would employ hundreds of thousands or even millions of people to address crises such as this pandemic. We're going to talk with him about exactly what that would entail, who would be eligible, how they would get paid, and how much that would cost. We're also going to talk with the CEO of the Chertoff Group about what he's talking to his clients about as they're concerned about various national security issues that arise because of this pandemic crisis as it comes up around the world. So that's coming up on the second hour of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio. That does it for Bloomberg Balance of Power on television and radio. I'm David Westin.